Hello, Jim. All right.
Working.
Now
I'll shoot my next movie with that.
now we're moving into the whole question of when you realized that Avatar was possible. You had created this thing that was impossible, and now suddenly you go, I see Gollum, I see King Kong.
Yeah.
It was Weta that made it possible, and Peter Jackson.
You know, I'm watching The Lord of the Rings. Not the first film, because Gollum was only briefly seen in the first one. I was a big fan of the first movie, but it wasn't until I saw the second one, and Gollum really came forward as a character, that I thought, wow, they're there. They're doing it. You know, maybe they're doing it only for a few scenes, but they're definitely doing it. It's possible. You know, and I had never forgotten Avatar, even though I had sort of iced it for a while. And then, you know, the third film took Gollum even farther, and you know, he became a fully fledged character. And then there was Davy Jones and King Kong, I think, more or less about the same time. And Davy Jones was, you know, in the second Pirates film, was real.
Now, what they did with Davy Jones, which was sort of amazing, was they actually had him, instead of being inside some space, you know, of a soundstage, you know, bare, he's running around in the ocean. That was the huge thing. He was in a real environment, right?
You
with the
have
dots.
Yeah, but you have to remember that what you find out when you drill down is that Gollum was a performance inspired by Andy Serkis.
It was animated.
And Davy Jones is a performance inspired by
Bill Nye.
Bill Nye. Not Bill Nye the Science Guy, the other Bill Nye. And it's okay, you know, at that point what they're really getting is a kind of a lower fidelity motion capture of the body that's based on it's an image-based system. And then they're recreating the facial performance. And it's good to get good reference, but they're not really capping the performance in a true sense. I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to give that much of it to the animators. I wanted to be able to look the actors in the eye and say, what you do right now on the set is what it will be. You'll just be blue and 10 feet tall. You know, and we'll have to do the ears for you, because you can't collapse your ears unless you can move your ears, in which case we'll have that as well. So it was a question of philosophy more than anything. I wasn't satisfied with the idea that a committee of animators would be creating the performance after the fact. I wanted it to be what the actor did.
But how are you going to avoid the stiffness and the almost a sense that the life force of the actors were being leached out of the Bob Zemeckis version of performance capture?
Well,
you must have had a sense of how you could avoid that.
Bob at the time was pioneering.
Right,
He was running out ahead of everybody, and he was doing things that nobody else had dreamed of doing, and I've got to give him total props for that. But there was something inherently flawed in the idea of doing marker-based facial performance capture, because it relied on a grid volume where the cameras were so far away that the data that was coming back... It was
like a square box with cameras up around on top of these walls.
It had two fatal limitations. One is that the amount of data that you need to create a face is probably an order of magnitude more refined as a mesh than what you need to recreate the body. So it forced, they were in a very compromised scenario where their cameras were forced in very close to the actors and still not really close enough to get true performance. So they worked in a very small volume. A horse could only take 2 steps. We worked in a volume that was 6 times by volume the size of theirs, and we could have done 10 times that if we'd had enough cameras. We weren't limited in how big our volume would be, other than the size of the room. You know, that's how big we could make it, because that's how big the room was.
But then you had something very close.
Because we were capturing the face through a completely separate capture pipeline, which was the head rig. And the head rig is actually something I had proposed to Digital Domain when I came in with the treatment of Avatar in '95. And I said, this is how we do it. We make a band that goes on the actor's head, and it supports a camera right here, and we photograph their face, and then we extract what we need through image analysis. They thought I was nuts then. I think Weta wasn't crazy about the idea when we started talking to them. ILM was dead against it at the time. They now accept it. because they had their own whole thing that they were doing, which they used for Davy Jones, and it made sense to them. But everybody was going off in these different directions, creating these different variants on the theme of these performance capture technologies. But I knew that I could not fail if I had 100% close-up of the actor 100% of the time, no matter where they turned, no matter what they did. And if I could move my motion capture cameras out as far as possible, then I could get my reference cameras in close, and people could just get right in the volume. So we've done scenes where we had 12 or 14 reference camera operators in the volume with cameras on their shoulders, up on ladders, crouched down, camera on the knee, all these different things in order to always get good reference of what the actors were doing, which is the other critical thing. The previous systems, the reference cameras had to sit out on the sidelines. They couldn't come into the volume.
Correct.
I believed in getting them right up next to the actors, just right where they were working, so that we always had great reference. Because the image coming out of the facial system was not something you could watch for performance. It was too distorted. It was too wide lens. It was nulled out, meaning that it was locked to the head. So it was like something from Pi, the Aronofsky film.
I see, like
where
a digital grid or something.
Camera's locked to you, and the background moves, and it looks very strange. So it's not. So we needed the facial camera stream, which went straight into generating the data set for the mesh for the CG model of the face, or for the CG animation of the face. And then we also needed the body capture, which was done in conventional motion capture way. We no bells and whistles on that. We did no improvement to that whatsoever. We just took Giant's system with their kind of biometric solve, which was very important for us, but it's something that already existed. And then we grafted onto that our facial capture system. And it worked beautifully, because we could gallop horses through the place. We could do giant battle scenes. We could run through the forest. Have all this kind of extended action. Didn't need to be all stitched together in little tiny snippets.
How did you do the bioluminescence in the forest?
Well, that's a whole other deal. After the fact.
The one thing in the movie that I don't know I have no idea how you did it.
Well, it's really just the CG lighting tools and the way that Weta does global illumination, and they actually treat light sources as real light sources, not cheated light sources, usually. So if something's meant to glow, it actually lights itself, and it lights the surrounding area in the proper way. And these are highly, highly computationally intensive things, because every photon, in a sense, is accounted for, and what it's doing, and how it bounces around and reflects, and how it reflects in water surfaces, and it's pretty complicated stuff. But the way Avatar was done is we worked in a proxy resolution, but it wasn't just resolution. It was like we didn't worry about things like that. The lighting was very crude. Well, we could throw a light on an object and light that object, but that object wouldn't really cast a shadow, and it wouldn't even shadow itself. So later, sometimes we found that in our template, somebody was in a position where if we lit them the way we had lit them in the template, they actually cast a shadow on the other person, and we had to move the lights around a little bit. I think the next generation of what we do, our template software will look much better, and we'll be able to do real-time shadows, and we'll be able to have better lighting tools and all that, so that what we create on the set actually is much closer to what the final image looks like.
So the part of the drama of this too was convincing Fox that you could pull this off.
Well, we had to go through it. We had to go through the steps, and one of the steps was we had to show them technically how we were going to do it. So the first thing I did was I said to them, look, I want to do Battle Angel, I want to do Avatar, there's some other films, some that aren't, maybe haven't even identified yet, but I identified a few films for them. I said, look, what I want you to do is put up, I think it was $10 million. Put up $10 million, and we're gonna create a studio. We're gonna work. It's probably gonna take us a year. Part of the money goes to designing the worlds of Avatar and Battle Angel. Part of it goes to generating the technology to make both those films possible, and then you'll amortize that cost over both those movies, or whatever else we do. Maybe it's a second Avatar film, but it gets amortized over that. And we're going to figure out how to do this. And we know exactly how to do it on paper, but we haven't actually done it yet. Oh boy, the amount we didn't know would fill a library shelf. But if you really knew how big the problems were, you just wouldn't do it.
So how many years
Lewis
did
and Clark would not have gone if they knew how hard it was going to be.
So this is 2 years of work.
It was about a year and a half of R&D, and the early on in that process, we basically got the studio set up quickly, and I wrote a quick scene because the script for Avatar didn't exist yet. I only had the treatment, so I wrote a 5-page scene. That's the whole, is the bioluminescence and kills the wolves and meets her and first dialogue with her and a little run through the forest and all that. And so we just shot it. I just hired 2 actors. It turned out that one of them is now quite well known, Yoonjin Kim, who's on Lost. I think she's still on the show. But she was actually on Lost at the time, but Lost hadn't gotten that big yet, I guess. So there was Yoonjin and a guy named Daniel Best, and so I took these 2 young actors and we just did the scene. We
capped it about 4 minutes.
Yeah, it was about 4.5 minutes, something like that. And from that we selected 40 seconds because it's all we could afford, and had ILM take it through to a so-called finished product. And it was somewhat representative of what we would do later, but not really, because to do it right, you have to spend about a year actually doing the rigging. Everybody talks about the scanning, and they keep thinking if they get a more and more finite and correct data set of the actor, that it will translate somehow to a better CG later.
That's equivalent to what they did with the Superman Returns, with scanning that guy, Brandon Routh, 360 degrees.
It's a waste of time because you can look at the surface with an electron microscope and it still doesn't do what the actor's doing. Because what the actor's doing is from the inside, from their consciousness, and informed by their emotions, they're firing off hundreds, literally over 100, I think, facial muscles to do all kinds of things in these very, very dynamic sequences that are sometimes very subtle, sometimes very overt. And the actual way in which their face kind of stretches and deforms and moves, and brows furrow and mouths open, and the interaction of the tongue with the teeth to form the various phonemes of speech and all that. These are things that you can scan the face from the outside all day long and you'll never be able to reproduce. And this is the thing that has eluded everyone. But if you build up the rig, the rig is the thing. It's not the scan. It's not that head scan. That head scan doesn't mean that much. It's the rig. And that rig takes time. And it's an amazing process, and one that scared the crap out of me. Because at first, the first thing I saw of Jake as an avatar was horrible. It was dead. It was off. It wasn't Sam. And I thought, oh my God, we've done everything right. And this is what it looks like. And Joe Letteri just had to say, you know what? It's going to be fine, but we're only halfway.
The rendering still has
No,
to
it's
take
not even
place.
the rendering. They were only halfway in the rigging process. He said we've got to live with it. We have to make all these fine adjustments to the rig. It's a dynamic process. So then, as we did more scenes, and we started to understand how Sam's face worked, and how Zoe's face worked, and how Sigourney's face worked, and Laz Alonso, the first time they tried each one of those characters, it looked terrible, but you live with it, and they have all these sliders, hundreds and hundreds of, they take the funneler, the orbicularis muscle, and all these other muscles, and they make these minute changes to them, in all their inputs to the rig of the character. They reach a point, it takes about 9 months, maybe sometimes as long as a year. They reach a point, a year into the process, where they can slap a brand new piece of facial capture onto the model, and boom, it comes out exactly what the actor did. Exactly. And so now we don't even think about it. We thought that the hardest thing on this movie was going to be the facial close-ups. We don't even think about it anymore. They just, okay, here come a bunch of new close-ups. Yep, that's good. Yep, that's good. Yep,
so
that's good.
So what was the hardest thing on the movie in the end, now that you're almost at the end?
Lighting for a sense of reality that would be the equivalent of being there with a camera.
Now,
and it's really understanding lighting and how lighting works. Not light in the real world, but how lighting for a movie works. Because what we're doing is, it's not photoreality. It's a it's a CG simulation of the false reality of Hollywood movie making.
Yes.
And that's a thing that everybody's got to understand. So I'm always taking the CG supervisors and the TDs through the process of, okay, if I were there on the set, I'd have an 8x Grifflon over here with a 2K into it, creating a bounce, and I'd have a 4K over there, and I'd create an edge light, and I'd talk them through it every time. And most of these guys have never had any on-set experience. They're now getting pretty darn good at anticipating what I'm going to say, because we've now done hundreds of shots. I think at this point, I can't even remember where we are right now. Somewhere around 1,500 shots have been done. So we're maybe less, maybe 1,400, but it's a lot. So the point is, they're now very good at anticipating what I'm going to say. But it was rocky at first, and they'd already done great stuff. I mean, there's King Kong is pretty astonishing. There's some pretty.
I was going to say the
realistic
jungles in King Kong,
yeah,
and
but
the animal fights in the jungles, weren't those all
They
digital?
did the jungles differently in King Kong. They did models. They did physical models. And some full-size live-action plates. They did, but mostly physical models. They did very little CG jungle.
Oh.
The biggest decision that we wrestled with on Avatar was how much of the jungle would be CG. And eventually, when we realized, and King Kong was not in 3D, they thought about it, but they decided not to make it in 3D. And Peter Jackson and I met over the whole thing of making Kong in 3D. And I was going to supply cameras to them and all that, but they just felt that there wasn't time to really get their arms around it in time. They were already, on final approach at that point. So they decided not to do it, and then he tried to convert it afterwards. And that wound up being a stillborn process, because the conversion process wasn't, anyway, I'm diverging. But the point is that Joe Letteri and I had long conversations about, how are we going to do this jungle? And eventually the decision was, well, let's do some tests and let's see what an all CG jungle would look like. So they did a test. They actually didn't do a jungle. They did a forest, like a deciduous, kind of a temperate forest. And it looked pretty darn good. It wasn't perfect, but it looked pretty darn good. And it really gave us confidence that we could get there because we knew we had the time on this movie. But CG in the past had always been a CG character in a photoreal setting.
Right.
Gollum was a CG character in a photoreal setting.
Is.
And District 9 is, and Pirates of the Caribbean. So you always have to play by the rules of the lighting that existed at the moment they shot the plate, which is a big leg up. Here, we can do any damn thing. We can do any damn thing we want. We can make it misty, overcast, rainy, bright sun, broken sun, hazy sun, whatever we want. So that's a huge dialogue that you have to have. And it's only because Joe has years and years of experience of real-world photography, and so do I, that we're able to just beat on it with a stick until it starts to pop out.
So part of what would be the most interesting here is when you've got the live-action characters in the CG universe with the CG characters interacting.
Yeah,
which you do have a little bit in the jungle. As I recall.
Exactly. We got a little bit there. We've got a little bit in the ambient room where when Jake first wakes up.
Great scene.
Yeah.
Great scene.
So there's some human interaction outside the ambient room in the Avatar training compound, where we have med techs jumping out of the way as Jake's kind of stumbling around, starting to run and all that sort of thing. And we have, helicopter pilots, and we've got a lot of stuff later in the battle where we've got human characters interacting with CG jungle and with creatures and all sorts of stuff. So we developed the three sort of unprecedented pieces of technology in the movie are, number one, the stereoscopic camera that Vince and I developed. Number two, and completely separate, unrelated subject, the virtual camera that we used in the volume, and the ability to do real-time, director-centric workflow on the production floor while we're working in a CG environment. And as part of that, the image-based facial performance capture, those two things kind of went together as the methodology for doing the CG portion. So you got a live action portion that's in 3D that required a whole new tool set, completely uncoupled, unrelated to the whole CG production, which was also unprecedented. And then the third leg of this that most people are not aware of is how we put the two together with the simulcam system. And the simulcam system was created for this movie. And it came about in the following way. I was just starting to work with the virtual camera, and I enjoyed working with the virtual camera. I saw endless possibilities for it. And I was talking to Glenn Derry one day, who helped develop the virtual camera system and integrated it with the Giant Studios method of capture and the facial performance and all that. It was all coming together, kind of maybe 5-6 months into the process. And I said, all right, this virtual camera is not really a camera. It's just an object. When we started with it, it was like a wooden stick. Seriously, it was like a wooden stick with an eyepiece on it. It was crazy, because really all it needed to do was have some markers on it, and the cameras around the volume would look at its orientation, and they would generate a real-time, a render of what it would see if it were a camera.
Right. It's a monitor, really. Well,
there's a monitor and a frame, and the frame is what you hold. The frame thanks, Terry. The frame generates the field of view, and the monitor shows it to you. And one of the early additions that I made right away was to uncouple the monitor from the frame, so that I could go up high and still see the monitor, and so I could go down low with the camera pointing up and still see the monitor. When the two were coupled together, it didn't work. It was very hard to get kind of vertical moves. So one day I'm talking to Glenn, and I said, look, this camera is not really a camera. It's just basically an aluminum frame with some markers on it and a monitor attached to it. But what if it were a camera? What if it were, in fact, our stereoscopic fusion camera system with some markers on it, in a volume, with a green screen? And if I had actors there, I could not only be shooting them photographically, but I could be seeing in my monitor, if we ran it through an effects switcher and we piped in from Motion Builder, from Giant and from Motion Builder, what the virtual world would look like. I'd see it. I'd see a real-time composite with a real-time track, real-time match move track. Well, that had never been done. Nobody had ever done that before. And Glenn said, let me think about that. He came back an hour later, and this is no bull. He went away for an hour. He thought about it. He came back and he said, I can't think of a reason why it won't work. And we did a test. We did a test a few days later, and we just got a little handy cam to use as a surrogate camera. We put some markers on it, and we shot our grip, Denny, in front of a green screen talking to an avatar. So one of our troupe were over there playing an avatar, and they were talking to each other, and it was a real-time green screen comp done on standard def video using a very early prototype of the simulcam system. And we got all excited about that, because that was going to revolutionize cinema, right? Turns out there were some problems. Like, the second you tried to light it, the lights started to spoof the systems, started to spoof the motion control system, or motion capture system. So Glenn went off for like a year to come up with a workaround to that. And the workaround was, instead of using passive markers that were actually being lit from each one of those cameras up in the grid. You've seen the grid. You've seen the hundreds of cameras. Each one of those cameras has a light right next to it that punches out, hits these little Scotch light markers, and comes straight back, like a stop sign. You know, like when you get right on axis to a stop sign, it lights up, but if you're off axis to the light, you don't see it. Same idea. So each one of these cameras was self-illuminating the markers using Scotch light. So Glenn said, all right, that's not going to work, because if I put any lights in the set at all, the system will think the lights are markers, and it'll get all fritzed up. And that's in fact what happens. You can't bring lights into the volume. Well, how are you going to do cinematic lighting if you can't bring lights into the volume? He said, I need something that isn't affected by the lights. So he said, he came up with this idea of active emitters. They were little clusters of LEDs that were emitting infrared, and they're synced to these industrial cameras. Really, they're industrial monochrome cameras. They're synchronized to them. They're putting out, I think, a pulse 20,000 times a second or something like that. The camera's reading it. The camera is reading only the frequency of the infrared, and it's able to tune out all the lights. So now we had a viable system that we could superimpose onto a film set, and we did that. And we did it for just about every composite shot in the film. And I was always able to see the background. And we had a little motion builder crew right there, and we had a giant guy and guy from Giant Studios who was monitoring the motion coming in, and it was feeding to a couple of motion builder artists, just our regular operators from the stage in Playa. We took them down to Wellington with us. We set this thing up. It was always glitchy. It was always a pain in the ass, and it was always so wonderful when it worked, And we found out all the reasons why it wouldn't work. We just had to keep beating on it with a stick through the whole process of live action, but we eventually got it dialed in. And when we did our reshoots here, our pickup shots a few months ago, we had a couple weeks of pickups. It was all simulcam, and it all went very smoothly. And the simulcam made it possible to do, stuff that I think, it's not that you couldn't do it, it's just the shots wouldn't be as good. They wouldn't be as natural. They wouldn't have a fluid kind of dynamic flow to them, because it's just a very different deal when you're following a CG character who's not there and you're operating in a real world set, or you're following a live action character who's got an eye line to a CG object or character, and you can look at it on the monitor. I mean, we were not only looking at it on the monitor when we did our pickups, we were dropping it into the cut and making sure that it worked to the nth degree, in that moment. And I think the precision of that process is reflected in the finished scenes, which are pretty darn seamless in terms of the live action matching the CG. Like there's a big fight at the end between an amp suit and creatures and Jake, and there's all this stuff where they're all interacting, they're all in different scales, and they're all human motion. The amp suit was performed by a guy, the Thanator was performed by a stunt girl, Neytiri was performed by Zoe and her stunt double Alicia, and Jake was performed by either Sam Worthington or his stunt double, who in that case was a guy named Elron Choi. And so you've got all these people playing different characters in different scales, all interacting, and we got it all to work. I mean, but it took us a long time to figure out how to shoot that scene. That's the one that we just left. It's like, forget it. Down in Wellington, we said, forget it. We can't do this scene right now. We figured it was probably 3 months to figure out how to do it. It wound up being like a year and 3 months.
Well, thank you, Jim.
That ought to be enough. You got tons.
I got plenty. I'm good. Thanks a lot.
All right.